Establishing immediate flank pressure, this opening gambit seeks to restrict black's central development while hinting at a potential queenside initiative. Opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing a solid pawn structure. Developing a knight to a natural square controls central squares, preparing for further pawn expansion and asserting early influence over the board's core. Developing a knight to its most natural outpost here prepares central challenges and supports potential pawn advances. Opening the center immediately to seize space and potentially develop an attacking initiative. Challenging the center immediately with d5 opens lines for immediate piece activity and potential counterplay against white's ambitious pawn push. Asserting central space, white aggressively pushes forward, creating immediate positional tension and restricting black's knight. Pushing the pawn here boldly stakes a claim in the center, yet it also creates potential weaknesses on the dark squares for black. Crushing the pawn chain opens a diagonal for the queen and creates immediate attacking potential. Black sacrifices pawn structure for piece activity, opening lines and disrupting white's central control. Recapturing with the pawn instantly liberates your queenside pawn structure, opening the d-file for potential piece activity and creating a central pawn majority that might prove decisive later. Black forces a queen trade, aiming to exploit white's slightly awkward pawn structure and open files, potentially simplifying into an endgame where white's doubled c-pawns become a long-term weakness. Your king's exposed situation on the d-file is now the paramount concern. White must prioritize its safety and swift repatriation to a more secure square, as black's bishop pair will soon exert considerable pressure on the queen side. Opening up the g-file for your rook might seem appealing, but that pawn chain on white's queen side now exerts serious pressure, potentially cramping your king's defense and limiting piece mobility. Stabilizing the pawn structure and preparing to develop the kingside pieces seems like the intention behind advancing the g-pawn, aiming for fianchetto development. Developing the knight to c6 reinforces control over d4 and prepares for potential queenside activity, creating a more balanced pawn structure for black's middle game. Relocating the monarch from the d1 square, this maneuver seeks to secure its safety behind a nascent pawn shield while also opening a crucial pathway for the remaining pieces to join the fray. Pushing the h-pawn now creates immediate weaknesses on the king side, potentially opening lines for your opponent's pieces later on, though it does gain some space and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this advance prepares to activate the bishop and potentially challenge black's pawn majority with a future a4. It's a strategic commitment that aims for long-term prophylaxis against black's advancing pawns. Opening up the queen side, this pawn push aims to disrupt white's developing pieces and potentially gain space on that flank. It might also be preparing to challenge the light squares or even launch a future queenside initiative, forcing white to commit their own pawns. Developing the bishop to this square creates a potent attacking spearhead aimed directly at black's king and further solidifies white's pawn center, which is now firmly anchored by the pawns on c3 and e5, hinting at a potential kingside pawn storm later. Black aggressively challenges the queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's planned queenside expansion and potentially open lines for their pieces. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain offers white a subtle positional advantage by preventing black's thematic breaks and securing breathing room for his pieces. A bold repositioning, this knight surges forward, immediately contesting the crucial e5 square and aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain stability by threatening to infiltrate on c4 or d3. Seizing space on the queen side with c5 aims to restrict black's knight and prevent its comfortable transfer to a more active square, potentially creating an outpost for white's own pieces. Black aims to develop the bishop to a more active square, challenging white's queenside space advantage while simultaneously preparing for castling or at least improving the king's safety. The fianchetto of the dark-squared bishop on g7 will become a key piece in attacking white's somewhat exposed king. Asserting central control with a pawn push offers a dynamic, if potentially risky, avenue for piece activity, aiming to cramp black's development and create attacking prospects on the king side. Embracing the chaos, black chooses to secure their monarch amidst the battlefield's unfolding drama. This bold castling decision, though seemingly defensive, actually aims to leverage the open files and potential attacking avenues that have emerged. By tucking the king away, black prepares to redeploy pieces and challenge white's advancing pawn chain, seeking to exploit the structural weaknesses that have been created on the queen side. It's a commitment to an active middle game where counterplay will be key. Embracing the asymmetry, white solidifies the queenside pawn chain, preparing to contest the open files and support a potential central pawn thrust. Developing the bishop to g7 activates its long diagonal, creating a potential battery with the rook on the d-file and offering a new attacking avenue towards white's kingside, especially once the central pawn structure solidifies. Breaking the blockade and simplifying the position, this capture initiates a shift toward a more open structure, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's castled king. Opening up the g-file with the pawn recapture creates a fascinating dynamic, giving your king a much-needed escape route while simultaneously placing the rook on a semi-open file, poised for potential action in the middle game. This pawn structure, while creating isolated kingside pawns for black, also grants significant central influence and a potential outpost on e5 for a knight, if it can find its way there safely. The immediate threat of the pawn push further complicates white's piece placement, potentially forcing awkward retreats or further concessions in material or space. Opening the d-file with the rook asserts control and creates attacking potential against black's potentially isolated pawns. Unleashing the f-pawn here is a double-edged sword, desperately attempting to disrupt white's burgeoning central control and potentially open diagonals for your scattered pieces. While it does create immediate friction and threatens to pry open the kingside, it simultaneously commits a significant chunk of your pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses down the line if white can effectively consolidate. This pawn push gambles on dynamic play and initiative, hoping to compensate for the structural concessions and the king's exposed position. Consider the long-term implications of this pawn advance. Will it truly lead to an advantage, or merely exacerbate your positional shortcomings? Developing the knight to f3 aims to solidify the center and prepare for potential kingside activity, while also offering a timely escape square for the king from the exposed d1. Black's bishop now eyes the queenside majority and anchors the pawn chain. A bold attempt to solidify the queenside by challenging black's pawn structure, potentially aiming to exploit the weakened kingside later. Recognizing the precariousness of the white king on e2, this bishop advances, preparing to exploit the open files and potentially disrupt white's already somewhat awkward pawn structure. Opening the d-file now forces black to make a decision about their active bishop. By removing the rooks, white is simplifying the position and moving towards an endgame where the extra pawn advantage might become more pronounced, though black's central pawn majority offers some counterplay. Reclaiming the open file with the rook solidifies black's central presence, offering immediate counterplay against white's potentially isolated pawn structure, and setting the stage for a robust rook endgame where black's doubled pawns, though awkward, can also serve as defensive anchors. Steering the rook to the open file immediately establishes a crucial presence, aiming to contest control and potentially squeeze the opponent's queenside pawn structure. Breaching the pawn chain with immediate pawn advancement now creates dynamism on the queen side, potentially forcing white's pieces into awkward positions as they react to this bold thrust. Initiating a sortie with the knight towards the d5 pawn aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces, a bold attempt to exploit black's somewhat scattered development and the exposed king. The rook swings over to d4, a potent demonstration of its newfound activity, aiming to disrupt white's entrenched central pawns and potentially prepare for further offensive operations on the queen side. Strategically repositioning the bishop from the active diagonal to a more supportive role behind the pawn chain aims to solidify the queen side and potentially reroute it to a better square, perhaps d3 or c2, to influence the central pawn structure which black has been aggressively challenging. The bishop now seeks refuge on the d7 square, a sensible retreat from its exposed position on c6, where it was a target. This redeployment aims to improve the defender's piece's coordination, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially reactivating the bishop for future queenside operations. Pushing the king forward like this amid the remaining pieces often signals a bold intent, perhaps aiming to awaken its dormant energy into the fray and create more dynamic possibilities, even if it introduces a degree of personal exposure. The pawn advances into enemy territory, disrupting white's centralized piece structure and creating immediate, unavoidable tension on the king side, opening the path for the rook to exert pressure on the c-file. Initiating a daring maneuver to contest the open file, black reroutes the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's rook activity and potentially unearth tactical weaknesses on the d-file. The knight pivots to a more aggressive central outpost, threatening to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain a foothold on the e6 square, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that might arise in the upcoming pawn exchanges. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank, targeting the exposed pawn on c5 and preparing to contest the d-file, aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for the queen's eventual redeployment. Reclaiming the open file with the rook immediately signals a shift in white's intentions, aiming to challenge black's control of the d-file and potentially prepare a central pawn push later. Pushing the pawn again aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially gain space, but it weakens the queenside pawn chain and leaves the square b4 vulnerable to future infiltration by white's pieces. Securing the b-file, white aims to prevent black's knight from finding any useful squares on the queenside, while simultaneously preparing for a potential queenside pawn advance. The bishop now aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside, while simultaneously seeking a more active diagonal. Redeploying the knight to its aggressive central outpost, this maneuver seeks to exploit black's doubled pawns and potential weakness on the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and perhaps create new attacking avenues. Reclaiming initiative and preparing to challenge the central pawn structure, the bishop repositions to a more active square, intending to exploit the open lines that have emerged. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file is paramount, forcing black to consider the recapture and the potential for further piece activity. Stepping back into the fray, this relocation of the rook aims to establish a robust defensive perimeter for the king's entourage, subtly probing for any potential weaknesses along the central files and simultaneously preparing to contest the now open d-file. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to provoke or exploit weaknesses on the kingside, particularly if black's king remains anchored on the queen's side. The bishop retreats to g7, seemingly a passive repositioning, yet it's a crucial step in consolidating black's queenside pawn structure and preparing for a potential pawn push on the kingside. Observe how it strengthens the e5 pawn and offers an escape square should the rook on d7 be challenged. This quiet maneuver highlights the importance of piece coordination in creating subtle advantages, even when direct confrontation isn't immediately apparent. A bold repositioning, white seeks to reclaim the initiative on the c-file ***, aiming to disrupt black's entrenched pawn structure and potentially expose weaknesses around the king, even if it means a temporary sacrifice of tempo. The black king cautiously steps forward, seeking refuge from the open files, a necessary maneuver given the current lack of active piece play to protect its flank. Asserting control over the central open file, the rook's repositioning prepares a potential queenside pawn push or a coordinated attack along the 3rd rank, aiming to destabilize black's already precarious king. Disrupting white's rook on c3, this move forces an immediate repositioning, attempting to exploit the king's exposure. The knight's return to g5 aims to disrupt black's centralized bishop, potentially forcing exchanges that simplify the position. White is clearly hoping to reduce the opponent's attacking potential and transition towards a more manageable endgame scenario. This maneuver also prepares to contest the d-file if black continues to occupy it with their remaining rook, though it doesn't immediately create any sharp tactical threats. unleashing a pawn sacrifice to puncture the queenside and draw the king into a more exposed position. This aggressive thrust seeks to exploit the slightly awkward placement of white's pieces. Opening the g-file to expose the black king, this sacrifice gambles on creating immediate attacking chances in exchange for material, a daring choice that forces black to react precisely. Black's king suddenly finds itself exposed to a potent mating net as white's pieces converge, a stark consequence of the material sacrifice that opens critical lines for attack. The king, suddenly exposed by its own pawns, now becomes a magnet for black's active pieces. The black king stands exposed, a tempting target as the rook abandons its defensive post on the 7th rank, seeking active counterplay on a central file, a risky gambit that could backfire if white capitalizes on the king's precarious situation. Unleashing the bishop offers immediate tactical pressure, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king's vicinity, though it sacrifices material temporarily in a critical endgame phase. The bishop's relocation to the contested kingside, despite its proximity to white's king, is a desperate attempt to disrupt the opponent's coordinated pieces and potentially create counterplay, though it offers little immediate defense against the looming rook on the 7th rank and risks leaving the black king exposed once white's pawns advance. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately introduces a potent threat to black's king. Sacrificing the rook to lure the king into a mating net and recover the piece with interest. The king's daring foray into enemy territory, seemingly an act of desperate aggression, fundamentally alters the material balance and sets the stage for a sudden, sharp endgame phase. The bishop's unexpected surge towards the king's weakened defenses creates a tactical nightmare for white, forcing their monarch into an even more exposed position. King sidesteps the immediate danger, seeking refuge on a more secure square to consolidate after the preceding pawn sacrifice. The immediate threat of perpetual check is now diffused, but the black king, having ventured far from its sanctuary, now faces a perilous journey back to safety through the open terrain of the queenside. A final desperate attempt to disrupt black's rampant initiative, forcing the king into an even more exposed position to achieve a pawn sacrifice that won't ultimately save the game. Embracing the chaos, black decides to chase the white king across the board, sacrificing the pawn that was so painstakingly defended. The ensuing tactical skirmish will likely open lines and create new imbalances, forcing white to constantly recalculate. This aggressive pursuit, while potentially risky, injects a much-needed dynamism into a position that was starting to feel a bit too static. The king's journey promises to be anything but uneventful from here. The monarch finds itself under immense pressure, desperately seeking refuge from the relentless pawn storm, while the king's escape routes are systematically choked off by the advancing white pawns. The king is now exposed to significant harassment. The immediate priority is to consolidate its safety behind the remaining pawns. The white king, surprisingly active, now endeavors to shield its pawn on b5 from further assault, seeking a precarious refuge. Sensing the critical square b5 is now defended, black aims to leverage the open files for counterplay and disruption, forcing white's king into a more exposed central position as it recaptures the pawn.